discuss the original divorce, which Scripture tells us clearly happened between God and the Jewish people. Because marriage is sacred not only because of its impact on children and society, but also because marriage was meant to be a reflection of the spiritual union that each one of us can have with Christ. It's a picture of how we can die to ourselves, make a vow of love to Him, and remain committed to that vow by His grace for the rest of our lives, without being unfaithful to Him, without leaving Him and adulterating that promise. That's what the blood of Christ made possible for us, is a true marriage that is permanent with Christ. And Israel was supposed to be a picture of that, of true worship and loyalty to Christ, and it wasn't. Let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 3 to read God's words about this archetypal divorce. Jeremiah 3 verse 1 says, "If a man divorces his wife, and she leaves him and marries another man, should he return to her again? Would not the land be completely defiled? But you have lived as a prostitute with many lovers. Would you now return to me? Look to the barren heights and see. Is there any place where you have not been ravished? By the roadside you sat waiting for lovers, like a nomad in the desert. You have defiled the land with your prostitution and wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and no spring rains have fallen. Yet you have the brazen look of a prostitute. You refuse to blush with shame. Have you not just called to me? My father, my friend from my youth, will you always be angry? Will your wrath continue forever? This is how you talk, but you do all the evil you can. During the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every high hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought, after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not, and her unfaithful sister Judah saw it. I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. Yet I saw that her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear. She also went out and committed adultery. Because Israel's immorality mattered so little to her, she defiled the land and committed adultery with stone and wood, with idols. In spite of all this, her unfaithful sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but only in pretense. And God continues to talk about His love for Israel, and Jeremiah talks about how a remnant of Jewish people will one day be returned and Christ will forgive them. But the whole Old Testament is full of God's anger and also His pain at what was done to Him by the Jewish nation that could have been a symbol of true spiritual marriage. And the effects of the Jewish nation's rebellion is still being felt throughout the world today, as we so often write about. And it has been felt in this area of individual divorces in society. God permitted Jewish divorce, which we can see in Deuteronomy 24, but He made it clear, Christ made it clear that it was only because of Jewish unbelief that this happened, and only because of the hardness of their hearts, which we're going to read in just a minute when we get to the New Testament. The Pharisees took it much further than what God allowed in Deuteronomy, however. And so let's turn to Matthew 19, where Christ responds to what the Pharisees had turned divorce into, which is the original no-fault divorce. No harm, no foul divorce. In Matthew 19. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea, to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" Which I read this week that in the original time, their listeners knew that they were referring to any cause divorce, which the Pharisees had developed through their false exegesis of the Old Testament by saying that when it says in Deuteronomy 24 that you can divorce your wife for adultery or a similar cause, it means any cause, basically. They were opening the floodgates for divorcing your wife for any reason. And we know that because we have quotations from them. Rabbi Hillel said, "A man may divorce his wife even if she burned his soup or spoiled a dish for him." In which case Aaron could have definitely divorced me by now. Rabbi Akiba said divorce is okay for a man, quote, if he should find a woman fairer than his wife. So, again, pretty wide open there. So the Pharisees came to Christ, and their listeners would have known exactly what they were talking about, saying, "Is no-fault divorce okay? Can you divorce your wife for any reason?" And Christ responded in verse 4, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate.'" "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, and marries another woman, commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry." Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way, others are made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." And here we have the clearest statement from Christ that you are to be married until death. There is to be no remarriage unless there is sexual infidelity. Because it's slightly different, we should also read Mark 10. So let's turn there for Mark's version. This is actually quite similar. I think I got confused because Matthew is actually the more full version. But again, here from Mark, we have a very clear eyewitness testimony of Christ's words that anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. That's Mark 10, verse 11. I've been reading evangelical writing to understand why the church has accepted remarriage of people who are divorced for reasons other than sexual infidelity. And so, despite the clarity of what Christ says here about no remarriage except for infidelity, we need to turn also to 1 Corinthians 7, because that's where we find the passage that a lot of pastors use today to justify remarriage. 1 Corinthians 7. Verse 10 says clearly, "To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? This verse in 1 Corinthians 7:15, which says that a believing man or woman is not bound to an unbelieving spouse who deserts them, has been called the Pauline privilege, which is used by evangelicals to justify remarriage after you have been emotionally or physically deserted by an unbelieving spouse. So this has actually been broadened to include emotional neglect and basically any of the reasons that a secular person would say that we have irreconcilable differences would be fit into this verse, to say that my spouse has neglected me emotionally, they're not living up to their marriage vows, they're deserting me in some way, and therefore I am free to divorce them and remarry someone else. Okay, so I would just like to state what should be quite clear from an honest reading of this scripture. In the prior verses 10 and 11, Paul is explicit that God's command is that you cannot remarry. If your spouse leaves you or you are separated from them, you cannot remarry. In fact, Paul doesn't even remind us about the adultery provision. He just says you can't remarry. You are bound to that person for life. So in verse 15, a believing man or woman should not feel guilty if they are deserted geographically by a spouse. And legally today, some Christians have had to legally separate before the eyes of the law from an abusive person. But that does not free them to remarry. Is that clear? So I believe that is clearly what Paul is saying, because we can't use verse 15 to negate what Paul is saying in verses 10 and 11, that it is absolutely forbidden to remarry. And Exodus 21, let's just quickly turn there, because this is also a passage that is used to justify remarriage, or in conjunction.
I just wanted to make a point really quick too.
Yeah.
In 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, Paul is making it clear what the Lord is saying.
Mm-hmm.
And the verses after that, he's making it clear that he is saying this.
Yeah.
Not the Lord, but I am saying this. And the prior verses, you should certainly see more importance there, because clearly he's saying that the Lord is saying this.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He does make that distinction. He says, not I, but God says not to remarry. And then he says, but in my opinion, I, not the Lord, think that you don't have to feel bad if your spouse does desert you and leave you. That's not your fault. Let's just quickly look at Exodus 21, verse 10, because this, along with 1 Corinthians 7, are used by apologists for remarriage. It says here that if a man is married and then marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free, without any payment of money. So this was a command from Moses, a law that God gave Moses to give the Israelites. Because of their hardness of heart, he was allowing wives who were neglected and abused to be able to leave their husbands. Does this mean that Christians today who feel that they are not receiving what they want from their spouse in terms of their marital rights is now free to divorce them and remarry another person? I don't think so. It couldn't be more clear from Christ and Paul. If you marry, you're married for life. Christ said that if your spouse is sexually unfaithful to you, you can remarry. Paul doesn't even include that. Paul just says you're married for life. In Exodus, this very humanitarian provision for the ancient Israelites, God saying if a woman is neglected and abused and she's not given food by her husband and he's starving her, then she can go and